So this is the last of the two webinars that still follow on from the data management workshop we had 2 weeks ago, 2.5, 3 weeks ago, I think now. Yeah. So today I'm gonna share some information about data documentation, metadata, and how you prepare data for publishing, archiving in line with what the UKRI or ESRC expect from GCRF projects, and then we can also discuss, and because I'm also interested to see what other projects are doing in that respect. If it's possible to ask everyone to turn the videos off. My internet connection is really bad. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna turn my video off anyway whilst I talk. So let me do that as well. And then other people can do the same. And we can switch the videos back on when we have the discussion. Good, thanks. Okay. So I'm going to cover briefly the UKRI expectations on making data available for reuse, how you then would typically prepare, document data, the importance of metadata, and where and how they can be archived, published. And this is again largely based on the kind of guidance we would have given through the UK Data Service to projects like GCRF projects. So this is based on a presentation that UKRI that I gave a few years ago together with somebody from ESRC and UKRI. So this is the wording of how they see the importance of data sharing. So a strong commitment to opening up research data for scrutiny and reuse to enable high quality research, drive innovation, and increase public trust in research. And that is strongly emphasized or written out in the Concordat on open research data that describes the sort of the principles that the UKRI sees as essential in terms of making data available. In terms of the ESRC, those of the projects that are then funded by ESRC within UKRI, as is the case for our project, for example, our GCRF project, Drugs and Disorders, specifically funded by the ESRC. On top of that Concordat, they also have their own data policy, and there is the expectation that data will be deposited at the end of a project. That can either be done with the UK Data Service, that's how it's written out in the data policy, or it can be done with via a similar responsible data repository. And to know what a responsible data repository is, there's reference there to the FAIR principles, and there's also the indication in the data policy that a DOI, a digital object identifier, as a persistent identifier is expected to be attached to the data that are being deposited. Now, if your GCRF project is funded by another research council, that might be different. So there's some nuances across the research councils, be it MRC or NERC, etc., on what their expectations might be. So we can discuss about that later, maybe, to see where the differences are. The FAIR principles, and hopefully most of you that work with data a lot are familiar with the FAIR principles. So it's a set of principles that's been drawn up at an international level. It's an interesting set of principles. It's embraced strongly by the European Union in their funding of research. For example, the 2020, the Horizon 2020 program, which is still ongoing until there's a new program that would start, has specific guidance on fair data management and considers the FAIR principles as setting the framework for good data practices in research. So FAIR stands for making your data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And this is a brief summary of what that means then in practice. So the next slide gives each of those principles as they have been published. But this is sort of a snapshot of what that means. What does it mean to make data findable? It means that you have good metadata that describe it. You have persistent identifiers that enables you to find them. You have the data published in a repository with a catalog that makes them findable, accessible, etc. Yeah? Making data accessible means that you have protocols in place that allow the data to be indeed accessible to people, to humans. Interoperability is very much driven by data and metadata adhering to standardized terms, vocabularies, metadata standards, so that machines can interoperate at the level of the data. And making data reusable depends a lot on them being clearly understandable, well documented, having a clear data license, etc. Yeah, so the principles as they are described there in more detail. What I would say are key elements in making data fair for a research project is when you have data sets that will be deposited at the end of a research project, to make sure that you have a persistent identifier, a digital object identifier for a data set. Typically, that is, if you deposit your data in a data repository, then the data repository typically ensures that you have a digital object identifier for a data set. Have sufficient metadata that describe what the data mean, that makes it usable, but it's also the metadata that will then ensure that findability, that will describe the access conditions, that will make sure that there is some potential for interoperability, etc. So metadata is important, and a clear license indicating how a data set can or cannot be used, whether what is allowed, what is not allowed with the data. Through expressing that through a license provides very clear information. An interesting tool that I find is the FAIR self-assessment tool developed in Australia by the Australian Research Data Commons. I've used it a lot also to do training, but it's also a good way to look at a data set and assess it to see to which degree is a particular data set after it's been published. Is it fair according to the FAIR principles or not? It contains, it's available online, it contains a lot of very good, very clear information, clear guidance, easy to understand as to what do the different criteria mean in those principles, and how do I interpret that to my particular data set. So I can definitely recommend that to test out how fair a particular data set would be. Good, so data documentation and metadata is then crucial. And when data are being made available, are being placed in a repository, are being made available for reuse by other researchers, the metadata and the documentation have different roles to play. Yeah, obviously, they describe a data set like a bibliographical reference would do. It gives information about the data set, but it also helps you to find a particular data set, because the metadata are also used by search engines. They are typically structured, they follow controlled vocabularies, etc. So it helps you to find data sets easy. It gives information about the use potential of the data, about access. To which degree can the data be accessed and be used? Is there certain restrictions in place? Are they openly available? What can or cannot be done with the data in future reuse is very important. It also helps to ensure that the data can be cited when they're being reused. It obviously helps ensuring that the data can be understood when they're being reused by other researchers. And there's also another important aspect is that a lot of this information can be exchanged between different systems. That's an important role of metadata, that you create it once and then you can be used multiple times by different systems. If you have a data set and you would look at how do we need to document that, then you typically need to have information on what is the methodology used, that the data were collected, were certain instruments used, experiments, fieldwork, procedures, etc. That type of documentation is obviously important to understand the data set, and is often described by the researchers in working papers, etc. So it can be compiled in different ways. For a survey, you want, for example, a questionnaire that's been used. If you have a data file that's tabular, you want to make sure that you can understand all the variables, that they have clear labels, clear codes. If you've done interviews, you want to have maybe information on the schedule, the questions asked, what was the consent agreements that have been used, because it might give an indication of how the data can be used in future or not, etc. A README file is a very good form to document a data set or a data collection, because it will typically describe the different components of a data set, what's in each of the files, what is the purpose of each of the files, what are the elements in each of the files, etc. Apart from having documentation at the level of a data set, you might also have important documentation within a data file, within the data set, at the level of the individual data. So in the case of tabular data, that is, for example, the variable labels, an indication of relationships within a relational database, for example. In a GIS data set, it would be indication on the different layers that are within a database, etc. So there can be a lot of interesting documentation that is almost embedded in a data file. That is important to also integrate within the data file, keep it in the data file, have it externally, whatever. But it's important to help understand what the data means. And for example, if projects that use SPSS maybe to carry out surveys and to analyze the data, you can embed a lot of very interesting, important documentation for each of your variables within the data file. But the same can be done if, for example, the data are held in CSV or in an Excel format. You can have a very clear list attached to that or embedded within the data file that gives a description for each of the variables that are part of the data file. Also, for qualitative data, you can have important documentation at the level of the data. For example, if you have an interview transcript, you can have some introductory information that provides some context information for the interview that took place, where, when it took place, who was interviewed, who was the interviewer. Speech demarcation is important information in your transcript. Having an overview of all the interviews as a data list, all the interviews that took place, why people were selected for interview, where the interviews took place, etc. So typically containing information of the data collection event, and also possibly some demographic information on the interviewees, were they male, female, what age, etc., which type of category of participants. All of that is important documentation for a data set at the level of a data file. So this is an example of a data list for a particular set of interviews, for example. Gives a clear overview of the different elements within a data collection. Metadata then is often highly structured, often adheres to certain standards, international standards and schemas, and some of those examples are the DDI, which is used a lot for social sciences, also medical sciences. There's standards for geospatial data, for example, ISO 19115. DataCite is an important metadata schema, typically for publishing data sets, for ensuring data citation, DOI, etc. Yeah, and metadata for a data set are typically generated at the time when data are being deposited with the data repository via online forms that capture that information as the data are being uploaded and published. And this is then an example of a data catalog where you have the metadata of a particular data set that then basically describes and provides key information on that data set. for users to be able to assess whether or not they're interested in reusing that data and how they can access it, for example. Behind the scenes, you often then have XML in the metadata, but that really happens at the level of the data repository. It's usually not researchers who generate that XML. XML is typically created by tools, but behind the scenes, that drives that information for the metadata. And this is another example also from the UK Data Service, where for qualitative data collections, detailed metadata at the level of each of the interviews, at the level of each of the questions and answer sections is embedded. That then allows very granular exploration of the content of particular interviews, with again the filters being used based on the left side, based on those metadata that have been applied for a particular data set. Licensing, I said, was important. So licensing basically means a welcome to your data set. It makes it very clear for users what are the rights or what are the permissions on a particular data set. Without any doubt. Typically, when data go to a data repository, they will have a selection of licenses that can be applied. Creative Commons is nowadays used a lot for data collections, whereby you can indicate whether a data set can or cannot be used, for example, for commercial purposes, whether it needs to be cited or not when it's being reused, whether it can or cannot be adapted and republished, so whether derivations can be made, etc. So there's a lot of options there available with licenses to choose from that make it very clear how data can be used in future. Data papers are an interesting concept. They've been around for a few years now, and I don't know, you might be familiar with those. A data paper is basically a paper that describes a data set and that describes the value of the data set, the use potential of the data set in very much detail. So it only describes the data set. It doesn't go into analysis of the data set. One of the journals that publishes data papers is Scientific Data. And for example, through the UK Data Service, a few years ago, we worked together also with NERC and their data centers with the Ecosystem Services and Poverty Alleviation Program on good data practices. That program was funded by ESRC, NERC, DFID, so very similar to in a way, to the GCRF projects. And I know that various projects from that program have actually published data descriptors in Scientific Data with data sets then either deposited with the NERC data centers or with the UK data service. So if data sets are created that have high reuse potential, it's an interesting concept to consider publishing a data paper. It also, through the metadata, you can then also create a lot of linkages between different systems and different resources. So this is an example of where we have linkage between a data set from that ESPA program deposited with the UK Data Service. That's what you see on the right-hand side. You can see the DOI that's being attached to it that provides persistence to the particular data set. There's related resources that are attached to the data set. There's a data paper in Scientific Data. There's metadata exchanged with the Gateway to Research, the UKRI Gateway to Research, that brings in information from the ground and that sends users to the ground page where publications are uploaded. The researchers have used their ORCID identifier, which means that the data set also gets sent via DataSci to the researcher's ORCID profile, etc. So metadata is in this case used in certain systems. For example, the Gateway to Research has metadata about the ground that's being pulled into the record for the UK Data Service automatically based on the ground. The information that's describes the data set, is automatically pushed to data site via the DOI, goes to the ORCID profile, etc. Through the linkage with the scientific paper, that information gets embedded here, etc. So metadata facilitate a lot of that exchange of information and linkages in this case. Another example of metadata where metadata from particular individual data repositories might be brought together into higher level data catalogs. This was a few years ago when JISC were developing a research data discovery service. That's, as far as I know, that's been abandoned. But a similar initiative that at the moment becomes more prominent, it seems, is Google Data Search, where again, metadata from different data repositories are pulled together into bigger portals that then facilitate their discovery and findability. Where to publish data then? So as said, for ESRC funded research data, so you can opt to publish it via UK Data Service, you can opt to publish it via another repository. This is some recommendations that OpenAIR makes, which is a European initiative looking at the opening up of research data. So recommendations they make is that you first look at the trusted domain repository that exists. For example, in the UK, we're lucky that there is well-established domain repositories for certain types of research. The NERC data centers, the UK Data Service, archaeology have a data center, etc. If that isn't available, then you can use an institutional research depository. And again, a lot of UK-based institutions have got institutional data repositories nowadays. And if that's not available, then you can look at more general purpose repositories such as Zenodo, which is a European repository that's been developed through Horizon 2020 funding or European Commission funding, and it's typically recommended for European funded projects to publish open data that underpin papers. Figshare is an option that's been developed in the UK. Harvard Dataverse is being developed at Harvard, but again, individual researchers can use these repositories and place data sets within them. Or you can search for suitable repositories. There's a registry called Retrieve Data. Data journals are then another option, although they will describe the data set. They would typically not hold the data set necessarily. So you would place the data set within a data repository, and then in the data journal, you would describe through a paper the content of the data set. ORCID ORCID, the Open Researcher Contributor Ideas, is definitely a good thing for researchers to use. A lot of institutions are pushing the use of them. A lot of funders are encouraging it. Journals are encouraging it. It allows information to be exchanged very easily about what researchers produce in terms of research, be it having grants, running projects, publishing papers, publishing data sets, etc. So it all gets connected up. The process for deposit with the UK Data Service then, if your project is funded by ESRC and you opt for that route, that will typically then go through what is called a reshare repository, which is a system in which the researchers themselves upload and publish the data, and the data service will carry out a review and make checks for example, disclosure checks, etc. So typically, you make sure that your documentation is prepared in advance before you start the process, that your file names are consistent and meaningful, that the data have been anonymized. If there's collections of multiple files, such as interviews, then you can bundle those into zip bundles to make it easier to upload. And you would check the best file formats that is recommended by the UK Data Service to make them to ensure the longevity of the data files. And then the process that the researcher or the research administrator carries out is to register with UK Data Service, create an online metadata record via an online form, upload data and documentation files, select the access and license conditions for each of the files and submit it. The UK Data Service then goes through the process of reviewing for completeness disclosure checks. Often there's iterations where there's communication back to the researcher for maybe changes to be made or enhancements to be made, etc. And only when the data service is unhappy that the data set can be published, will it be published into the repository. So again, what have we done so far for the drugs and disorder project? And then I'm also going to be interested in what other projects have done in their projects. So as said 2 days ago already in the presentation then, so the type of data, we work with partners in Afghanistan, Myanmar, Colombia. In each of those countries, there's 2 research organizations that carry out most of the research and the field work. The data being collected are interviews, life histories, focus group discussions, observations, photographs, also surveys, compilation of third-party data, newspaper articles, for example, and satellite imagery. So a mix of quantitative and qualitative data. So the digital files that are then being created is Excel tables from the surveys. Also some of the interviews are being entered into Excel tables, worked up to Excel tables, MP3 files, if there's audio recordings of interviews, JPEG images for images that are being taken, and then a lot of the interviews are being transcribed and translated as Word documents. So whilst the research is ongoing, both the researchers based in the UK and myself have worked a lot with the partner organizations to develop good data practices. Most of the partners have got their own data manager as well, so they have somebody who's responsible for the data management within their organization. And I must say that I only joined the project a year into the project, and already there was very good data practices in place that had been implemented by the researchers, UK-based researchers working with the local partner organizations. So the focus of what we've been working on is data security, of course, is a strong aspect that we've worked on a lot. We talked mostly about that on Wednesday, so I'm not going to go into details there. But for example, checking the quality of data after data have been entered in tables, after data have been transcribed, whether there's consistency in how data are organized and structured, making sure that they're all organized and kept well in logical order, in logical folders, and that the collections are complete, making sure that there's consistent coding applied to files, and that coding is also reflected in the data sheets. For example, in Myanmar, hundreds of interviews have been carried out. So there we're checking that for all of these interviews that there's a clear coding implemented for each of the interviews. Each interview is described in a data sheet that gives an overview of the interviews carried out. That in there's an indication whether there's a translation done, a transcript exists, a summary exists, whether there's an audio file, whether there's notes that have been taken, etc. So ensuring that all of that is clearly documented. For the qualitative data, then also there's standard templates that are being used for making summaries, transcriptions, translations that have got clear headers, information that are consistent in their layout, etc. And since I joined the project, I've developed a lot of practical guidance according to the needs of the different partners and the type of research being done, which is also available on our website. So there's a general data management guidance document that continues to grow as and when there's a need to add further information. And I've also, because some of the partners are doing taking a lot of images, I've also looked at a solution for organizing, documenting, and managing digital photos with an open source tool called DigiCam, and specifically for the partners in Myanmar and Afghanistan that have got very basic infrastructure. So it's a very easy tool that doesn't require online access, etc. And then in terms of documentation, I've developed the data management plan from the moment that I joined, and I keep that up to date. So that gives an overview of all the data sets that are being created at any one time. We make sure that all the data tables have got good variable descriptions, good explanations of each of the variables being used in the data file. All the collections of interviews come with data sheets in an Excel table that provides information about each of the interviews taken place. Papers have been prepared this year. There was a special issue of a journal in which most of the partners published a paper or prepared a paper for it. So we've been including data statements for each of those papers that indicate which data sources have been used for the paper. We've also checked that there's clear information in the methodology on the data sources being used, etc. So those are the documentation aspects. In terms of data repository, we're starting those discussions. Actually, next week we've got, as part of our annual workshop, we've got a discussion with all the project partners on data sharing options, data repository options, and what we want to develop for the project. There's local partners that are interested in also developing their capacity for having an own data repository, but the reality is that they have limited technical infrastructure, limited technical capacity. So that's a reality we need to take into consideration as to what solution we can develop or implement. We know that the UK Data Service is an option where the data can be archived. We might also look at options such as a Dataverse instance for the project. We might look at other developments. That's very much ongoing, and I'm interested to hear what other projects are doing in that respect, what they are thinking of doing with their data. So far my presentations, I think we can have some discussion. Okay, I don't see anything in the chat box yet. Good. So I'm interested to hear from other projects what they are doing in terms of maybe data documentation, data organization, but also what are your responsibilities for data archiving at the end of the project? What options are you looking at with your project? Who wants to kick off?
Well, maybe I wouldn't mind. My name is Alfonso. I'm working as part of the Recirculate project. I've been voluntarily assigned as data manager for the work package. And well, it's a learning curve right now. Mm-hmm. I'm aware there hasn't been much conversations about, which should be a suitable. So all these topics about data management, preparing the metadata, which repository might be suitable, and so on. But I know that actually right now there is ongoing some discussions about that, as being highlighted as one of the needs for the project. We've already been, I think, maybe almost 2 years on the project. But as far as I'm aware, there is no centralized guidance on how we are expected. It's true that the nature of our data sets might be very different, but I guess that the organizational aspect will be shared. So yeah, pretty, I would say, early stages in that respect. So I can't really contribute much in terms of saying we've gone down this route or the other. But what I can say is that this has been very useful for, probably is going to be very useful for the project. So thank you for the presentation and help.
Okay, thank you, Alfonso. Anyone else want to share what they're doing in their project?
Yes, I will just continue from where Alfonso has left off. My name is Ruben. I work on the same project as Alfonso, just on a different work package. So our work package is mainly social science, environmental, and other geospatial techniques. So we are generating qualitative data and also spatial data. That's drone footage and spatial attributes of household. We are collecting data on household members and their demographics, their water use, their toilets, and other variables. So this, we have generated survey data that is that has the household IDs and the blocks. So we have some identifiers of the households in the data set. So we have the blocks where they live and their household IDs and their names. That's to help us follow up, because it's kind of a longitudinal data we are collecting. So once we are done with particular stage, you try to anonymize it so that people cannot trace it. But in the intermediate stages, we still keep them to help us still follow up on those respondents. But the qualitative data, once we are done, we just take all identifiers off, their names, pseudonyms and all that. Then we store it in the data archives of the university. We also share with our local partners in Africa. So it's kind of, we all have access to the data. So before we share it, we remove all the identifiers from there so that other people can use it. But at the moment, it's still at the early stages. So we haven't really started publishing from that. So it's a bit at the early stage of the whole process. So that's a little experience from.
In which countries are you doing the research?
So we're working mainly in Ghana, but the project also has affiliate institutions from Nigeria and other East African countries.
Yeah. And is there like local data repositories that exist in those countries?
Not really. Yeah, so it's kind of, we are hosting the data here in the UK.
Yeah.
And we share with partners where necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. What do other projects do, or what do?
Hi, if I may come in just for a moment.
Yeah.
Hi, and really, really interesting presentation. Thanks ever so much. Lots of good links and things I'm going to definitely check out after this call. For our project, we work on a health economics project called Tanzilanze, working in Malawi and Uganda. A lot of our data is actually secondary data. Had a useful discussion on this in the workshop earlier last month. I suppose from our perspective, it's useful to hear from others about kind of what our responsibilities are around kind of the open access of things like quantitative analysis code of secondary data and that type of information, which is probably more of what we're producing. And so be really interested to hear some ideas maybe from others about how we're best going about making that available. And I think it's kind of a second question. I was really interested to hear about the scientific data kind of journals and the data journals as a whole. I was just interested to hear about kind of the reach of those, and whether, say, a data journal might, say, accompany an academic publication in another journal, or if they're kind of used in their own right. So I don't have much to contribute from our project in terms of experience, but a few questions would be interested to hear from others about.
Yeah. Is there people in the group that have got answers for what Alex asks? How to do open access for analysis codes? Everyone is very quiet. It's Friday. I think, I mean, in my experience, it depends at times on what the journals in which the papers appear, what their expectation is, whether they would like to see the codes being available either for peer review or for reproducibility. Yeah, so that's a strong driver, and you definitely see researchers who make code available on, for example, on GitHub or something like that, and publish it there. I don't think from the funder's point of view that there's a strong indication there as to what would be their expectation. So I think it needs to be more driven by the research community or by the journal for it to be made openly available. Yeah, in this case. And the linking scientific data with other data papers, with other papers. I mean, obviously, again, there's journals who will expect that when a paper is published, that the data are made available somewhere, again, for peer review or for scrutiny or for future reuse. And it depends again on the policy of the journal. PLOS, for example, have a very strong expectation, so that might also determine whether or not, as a researcher, you will place your data set in a repository, or then think, oh, it might be better if I describe it in a data paper, because that then provides an extra detail of information. I think it depends probably on what the researchers want to achieve in terms of outputs. That needs to play a role there, I guess. Yeah, I don't know whether there's other people who've got other projects who've got experience with that.
Barbara's got her hand up, Veerle.
How do I need to unmute her?
No, thanks.
Okay, I think you can just do it yourself. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, I have got zero experience with this, so I can't really answer the question. But I mean, the main issue for us is how to make it as user-friendly as possible for potential people who want to use that data, and in particular for partners in Africa who do not, like many master's students or PhD students also don't actually have easy access to journals, to data. They might not even know about some of this. So for us, I think the main criterion would not be so much about what is required by journals. Okay, that might be in certain cases important, but it's really more about how to make it as useful as possible, which might need to include some kind of, I don't know, introductory document actually saying this is what we did, these are the different tools we used, and almost like sort of pointing people to what these different files are and how to use them. So sorry, I did miss the better part of the presentation because my previous call was overrunning. So I don't know whether you talked about that. But yeah, sort of whether there's scope to include some kind of guidance document that explains how the
data can be used.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting comment. And I think, yes, in a lot of countries that is important, that it can be so difficult for local researchers or local students to find useful resources of information or data or papers or publications to work with on which to base their own research. And that's definitely something we need to be conscious about, that's an important aspect to consider as well. It's also part of that capacity building. And I think we see it with the partners we work with, that they also are interested in making sure that the data resources that are being generated now, that they can sort of keep them for the long term, and what is then the best option for making sure that they can keep them in a useful way, so they don't go lost. Have you thought in your project, Barbara, on what infrastructure might be available to keep those data in the long term?
Yeah, effectively, there is no sustainable infrastructure because people use, they don't normally use university servers or their organization server. They all have information on their own laptops, which might be stolen, crashed, replaced, and so on. So actually using the UK Data Service as a kind of, almost as a kind of cloud storage for people who don't have any other infrastructure for that. I mean, that's what we have in mind.
Yeah.
It's actually a question.
Which countries are you working in?
Well, for this GCRF project, it's Ethiopia, Ghana, and Zambia.
Yeah.
And then we have other colleagues working on other GCRF projects who work in India, China, and Kenya.
Yeah.
I mean, it might well be that these countries do have some infrastructure if you work for an academic organization with a good infrastructure. But I mean, our partners, the idea would really be to make sure that all partners can access this data, and therefore having a kind of externally managed cloud server that people can log into and use would be much better than having it sit with one particular organization that might have all kinds of restrictions.
Yeah, that's true. That's something to keep in mind as well. Yeah, that you might have one organization who then keeps it for themselves and still not share it with others. That might be complex as well. I know that looking from experience, looking at other organizations that are based in low-income countries, research organizations, Dataverse is at times also a solution they look at, because you can set up like your own collection of data for your institution, so you can create sort of an institutional presence on that system, which is based in Harvard. Of course, it does mean that the data will be in the US rather than in your own country. I'm also interested there. I see Bet from IAED is on the call as well. I don't know whether with IAED you have experiences of working with local partners and how you manage data at the local level. What long-term solutions might be available or might not be available. Sorry for putting you on the spot, Bet.
I think Barbara would actually be better.
Is she on the call as well? Yeah.
Yeah, Barbara and Beth are on the same project, I think.
Okay. So Barbara, you're also based at IAED, are you?
Yes.
Okay,
we work on the same project. We are actually three from Sentinel.
Yeah.
We've got Adam from Imperial College, who's also on the call. So sorry, we are a bit. But the reason that three of us on the call is, at least from the IAED side, is that we have got very, very little experience with this, and we haven't got systems in place. That's why we are keen to learn and to find out about the options that could work, in particular for also NGO partners and students from universities. So exactly for those type of stakeholders who don't have access to a good institutional system that might be available in their countries. There was also another question from Beth in the chat box specifically about templates that would be quite useful if you have a chance to look at that. Sorry, we are quite new to this, so some of these questions you might find a bit...
Okay, yeah, I hadn't been looking at the chat. I think in terms of template, yes, the UK Data Service on the website, they definitely have templates for things like creating a data list, so like a table that gives an overview of a collection of interviews, templates for transcription. Is there other templates that you would think of for documentation? Things in terms of variable descriptions, that's just, yeah, I guess you just, the standard information you would apply is to, for each of the variables, you have a description, you explain what the codes mean. The best there is probably to look at how that information is structured in a system like SPSS. What are the options in there? And there's a question from Chris, is there guidance for keeping collections of data together? For example, the reuse of data by other researchers may require raw and processed data. Is there guidance on how these can be kept together within the archives?
Shall I explain that a bit more?
Yeah.
So often, we might be working on biophysical data, social data, household surveys, etc. And those, if you're taking up a thematic repository, there's no point in putting biophysical data, or is there a point in putting biophysical data with your
social data,
social science
yeah.
data?
Yeah.
Because the archives have expertise in their thematic areas.
Yeah.
So it's always been a little bit of a problem to us how to split the data, or whether to split the data between archives, whether to just keep it all in an institutional store so that you can keep it all together.
Yeah.
Because if, say, someone wanted to work on our previous project on Ghana data, they're going to need both sets of data. Both are going to inform them, and then they might need what I consider to be the useful data, which might be processed data, but their reuse of data may rely wholly on going back to my raw data. So again, it's about how do you keep that association between data across data and across data archives.
Yeah.
And I use things like zipping to, which aren't very long-term structures, to keep things together. Just put it all into one big folder, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's different options there. It probably depends on what you prefer. I know that through the UK Data Service, we've worked quite a few times with the NERC data centers in particular, where we had sort of multidisciplinary data collections. And so sometimes it would be the case that social data would come to the UKDS, the biological data or the ecological data would be with the Center for Ecology and Hydrology, and then we would make sure that through the metadata that there was that linkage being created. At other times, I know that CEH have sort of said, well, it's easier if projects prefer, they can just deposit all their data from, for example, a NERC-funded project with us, even if there's interviews in there, etc. We can keep it all together. Typically, normally a data archive would also, or a data center would also be able to, if data being archived, if it's a collection, that can consist of multiple files. It's not the case that you can upload just one file and that's it. So you can have a data set can have 10, 15 different data files. So you could have in there your raw processed biological, social. It could all be part of one particular data set.
Yeah, that's an important consideration
Yeah.
could be made quite early on in your project, because we might have in Ghana on a project we worked with previously, which we're now working using that data that we deposited in an archive or in our own repository. We're now using in the Grow project I represent.
Yeah.
We deposited that, and we can gain access to it because we sort of have the ownership of it. But
Okay. Yeah.
we, in the previous project, we just created one metadata record rather than the 2,000 metadata records, which represent, if you like, the individual data sets within that.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's a big decision to make.
Yeah.
Early on, whether you're going to do one metadata record and obviously have data documentation associated with it, or create 2,000 records with different permutations of the metadata.
Yeah, that's a lot. So just out of interest, where did you put your data? Where you say we put them in a repository and now we're reusing them?
Well, it's in a University of Southampton institutional repository.
Okay, yeah.
And it's also on a data portal, because those are different things. That's the other thing that we are always exercised about. Whether an archive is about storage and access, but a data portal is about promotion and access, if you like. So I think they have different roles, and that's not often well understood.
Yeah.
So we've got it on a GeoNode application.
Yeah.
Sorry, a GeoNetwork application, and we've got it on an institutional archive.
Okay, and so through the portal you can promote it, and then
that's right. So it's much more readily
by the repository.
Yeah, you can immediately view the data, which they can't usually so they can download it, and they can embed it as a WMS, a web service into their own projects or their own, in this instance, geospatial data.
Yeah.
So they fulfill different roles, and they're not really often explained within this sort of description of discussion about data management within a project.
Yeah.
Because you've got these different phases, if you like.
Yeah.
Operation within the project, operation sort of, if you like, post-project, but still ongoing.
Yeah.
And then archived. And I think we've been looking at it in those three periods as being slightly different structures and technical requirements.
Mm-hmm. No, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that would be really, could be very different for different projects. It really depends on what kind of data you are and how the logical structure, the logical organization takes place at different levels. Yeah.
It's more about the different, a portal works very well for geospatial data, but there's no reason it can't work for spreadsheet data or household survey data.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because everything happens somewhere and at some time. So in a sense, it should be able to handle all of that, so long as you've got metadata structures that allow you to explore and extract.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
And the partners you then work with abroad, presumably they can access it then from where you have them in the UK, the data in that particular case, is it?
Yes, yeah. But they also, under the earlier project, they set up their own geoportal. So there's shared harvesting between the portals.
Yeah, and of course that's that's a good option as well, in that you can, in a way, that's a good explanation that you give there, that you can say you want to make sure that the data are stored somewhere safely, that they're still going to be there in 10, 15, 20 years time. So you have one place for archiving, but it doesn't stop you from promoting it in different organizations or in different institutions, also through their portals again, which is an interesting
also a requirement.
Yeah.
And also this is sort of a requirement that if they use the data, they're essentially signing up to redeposit their reuse of it. So if they're creating data products from our data sets, then they aim to put those back. We aim to ensure that they put those back into the system, so that they're also recorded, and there's a sort of legacy of the impact of a data set to wider research.
Yeah.
So what we did there was we were working in 3 countries, Bangladesh, India and Ghana, and each of them had their own portal, and the University of Southampton had its sort of central portal, if you like.
Yeah.
But the idea was, distributing portals is an effective way, but also it was about capacity development. Yeah.
And that is a reality, that if the capacity doesn't exist, then it's very difficult to develop capacity, especially in the long term, that is sort of sustainable.
I'm sorry,
okay.
I have to dip out now, so thank you very much.
Yeah, I think we're going
Thanks
to
for
close the call
presentation.
unless somebody still has a question or a comment. One of the participants from Wednesday actually asked whether it would be possible to continue with maybe a regular catch-up to share experiences and share information with each other on data management aspects of our projects. It seems like a really good idea. So what we might do is when we contact all of you again to say that we've put all the information online, like the presentations and the write-up still of the workshop from a few weeks ago, that we might also see whether there's wider interest in doing that, and maybe have a monthly or a 2-monthly call to just share some experiences with each other. Yeah.
Beth's just got her hand up, Veerle, and then we should close after
Hi,
that.
sorry, just related to what you're just saying, I just wanted to ask about the recordings and the slides. Would we be allowed to share those more widely with our project teams and initiate discussions with them about it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said, we'll put all those online, but give us a bit of time, because this is now coinciding with our annual workshop. So Jay has been very busy with that as well. I've been busy with lots of things. So it might be next week or the week after by the time we've got it all ready to put online. But yeah, we'll definitely make it available online at some
That's
stage.
great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your day or the weekend, if that's soon about to start.
Thank you, Veerle. It was very useful.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.